Hi there. Let's go over the lecture on energy and life, chapter 4. These are the major topics that I'm going to go ahead and cover. Starting off with defining biological energy. So what is energy in organisms? How energy flows using living organisms, obviously, right? Like, for example, in cells, there's organelles in plant cells that are called chloroplasts. Right, so they go ahead and produce ATP, and they utilize ATP to a certain extent to allow plant cells to create their own metabolism products like glucose, for example. And then the mitochondria, which is also found in plant cells, but mostly in animal cells, allow us to produce the ATP that we need in order to carry on with our in order for us to produce work, to do work. We'll go over the two stages of photosynthesis, the light reactions, Calvin cycle, and then we'll go over the three stages of cell respiration, which are glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. I'll end up with talking a little bit about fermentation and then introducing you to metabolism. All right, so let's go ahead and start off again by defining energy. So all living things require energy. Some actually make their own energy through the use of photosynthesis, but then animals, for example, cannot make their own energy. So we have to consume and transform that energy from the food that we eat and the oxygen that we breathe. Okay, so as has been mentioned already, ATP, adenosine triphosphate, is a common currency, energy currency for cells. And I'm talking about all cells, even bacterial cells. Okay, so what ATP does in the way in which it provides energy is by its breakdown, essentially. Okay, so this is ATP. It's a big nucleoside molecule. It contains a sugar backbone, just like DNA and RNA for that matter. It contains 3 phosphates and then a base right here. So it looks like a nucleotide, a DNA nucleotide, but it's not. It has more phosphates than a DNA nucleotide. It's got 3 phosphates instead of 1. So therefore, we utilize this molecule as ATP because the energy found in these 3 phosphates is tremendously large. Okay, so we can harvest that energy to be able to power biological mechanisms, right? Like DNA replication, for example. So how do we do it? Well, we do it by stripping off one of the phosphates. Okay, so these phosphates are highly energetic, and we can use those electrons from the phosphates. Again, in our everyday activities, we are able to produce to do work because of the actions of phosphate. If you recall, phosphate has a structure with a phosphorus in the middle and 4 oxygens around it. Okay, so oxygens are highly electronegative, meaning that they have many available electrons to give away. Okay, so that's where most energy comes from. Okay, so let me just kind of give you an overview of the first and second laws of thermodynamics. First and foremost, energy cannot be created or destroyed. We can only convert energy, and that's precisely what we do in the body. By ingesting food, by breathing in oxygen, we convert those two into usable ATP, into usable energy. All right, same thing with plants. Plants utilize radiation, right? UV radiation and sunlight, and any type of light for that matter, to be able to convert that light into usable ATP that the plant can use to be able to survive and do the work that it does. All right, so now energy versions, such as the ones that I just described briefly, release heat. So every living thing, as you have probably noticed, releases heat. All right, so just touch your skin, right? You should notice that your skin is warm. Okay, so you're releasing heat at all times because of the conversions, right? Energy conversions that you are undergoing. I believe I've already described entropy before. Entropy refers to disorder. Okay, so everything in the universe follows these laws of physics that say that entropy increases, right? It increases as time progresses. So therefore, disorder goes up as time progresses. But not in life. Life is highly ordered. Okay, so life has a very low entropy um, intrinsically, and that's because again of the order of life. But nevertheless, to a certain extent, to a certain point, at least in the conversions that occur in molecules, right? Those molecules do tend to move towards disorder just because of their breakdown, because they're breaking down a large, well, a ring of glucose, if you will. Breaking that down lowers the order of the glucose molecule, right? So that process right there moves towards disorder, even though it happens within a highly ordered cell. Hopefully that makes sense. Right, so energy flows. Okay, so we know this. We've seen this before. We know that energy, and you can actually observe it. Right, energy flows from autotrophs to heterotrophs. Okay, autotrophs, heterotrophs. Well, how is that, or how does that happen? Well, autotrophs contain plant cells which have chloroplasts. And I shouldn't just say plants because some bacteria are actually photosynthetic. Okay, cyanobacteria are photosynthetic bacteria. So some bacteria and all plants, right, are photosynthetic, meaning they utilize UV radiation from the sun to be able to make their own ATP, make their own glucose, have the plant grow and respond to the environment and everything. But then we have the heterotrophs here, right? So like us, for example, animals, which come along and eat those plants. All right, so we eat those plants and we obtain a few things from the plants. We obtain the sugar as we eat the plant, and we obtain the plant's oxygen as they metabolize. Okay, so converting heat into usable energy, right? That takes metabolism processes which release oxygen. I'll go over those processes in a few minutes. Okay, so that releases oxygen, which we are able to take in. We breathe that in. So we take that oxygen over to our cells, and then our cytoplasm goes ahead and breaks down that the sugar that we've consumed from the plant itself. The oxygen goes ahead and collects inside of the mitochondria, and though the combination of those two is able to make ATP for us. Okay, so it said that one glucose molecule, as long as there's oxygen around, can make anywhere from 30 to 36 ATP per glucose molecule. Every time you take a bite out of a carbohydrate food, you're ingesting billions of glucose molecules. Okay, so you can do the math right there, yeah, and see how much ATP comes out of of the food that you ingest every time you take a bite, right? So that's a lot of ATP right there. So I mentioned producers, consumers. Producers are mostly plants, but also photosynthetic bacteria. Um, so algae would be a type of aquatic plant, which is also photosynthetic. So it produces its own energy, right? And then we have heterotrophs. We have consumers, which obviously are meant to eat plants and produce energy, produce ATP in that manner. Okay, so um, here's more or less what happens here in photosynthesis. Photosynthesis is the first process I'm going to go and describe. this is the overall photosynthetic reaction. Okay, so we have carbon dioxide, which we release from our bodies, from our as a waste product of metabolism. So we release that, we breathe it out into the environment. Okay, so plants are able to take up CO2 using a plant structure called stomata. So they take up CO2, and then they're able to put that CO2 in to the stroma, right, which is the liquid part of the chloroplast, to be able to produce glucose from that process. Okay, so it's called a carbon fixation. I'll go over that in a few minutes. Now, plants also require water. We should know by now that water is actually absorbed from the soil using the plant's roots. And then sunlight obviously comes from UV radiation from the sun, or any source of light that you expose your plants to. And then, so that combination right there inside of the chloroplast manages to make sugars, right? Like glucose, for example, and oxygen. Oxygen for plants is a waste product, so they go ahead and release it out. But then sugars are very important for the plant because it's the plant food, and then it's also a power source for the mitochondria, which is also found in plant cells. Okay, so again, here's where the photosynthesis takes place. It takes place in the chloroplast. Just as a brief reminder, let's go over the parts of the chloroplast real quick. Here they are. Chloroplast, as all eukaryotic organelles, contains a double membrane. So it contains double membrane here, which is going to go ahead and surround the chloroplast structures, provide protection, and allow molecules to move into and out of the chloroplast. Okay, so the second part of the chloroplast would be the stroma, which is the fluid part of the actual chloroplast itself. And then we have the grana. This is a granum right here, which is full with stacked thylakoids. Okay, these green discs, those are called thylakoids, right? So we have thylakoids right there. And then thylakoids contain, and the reason why they're green is because they contain chlorophyll. Okay, so they contain chlorophyll molecules that allow them to absorb sunlight. Right, so here's, in a nutshell, what chlorophyll does, right? So chlorophyll is a pigment molecule, which is meant to, again, absorb some sunlight, but then it also reflects a lot of it. Okay, so it's going to go ahead and absorb essentially all the colors, if you will, of sunlight, but then it's going to go ahead and reflect green. Right, so that's why we see, for the most part, leaves being green, because they're reflecting off green light while absorbing every other light from UV radiation. Okay, so in that manner, they're able to excite these chlorophyll molecules to release electrons that are going to go ahead and be utilized for the production of ATP. All right, so electrons, you can think of electrons the same way in which they actually power your cells, your devices, right? So any device that requires charging, right? As soon as you connect it into the electricity outlet, electrons are going to start flowing into the battery of that device. Okay, so those stored electrons are able to power that device as long as the battery contains stored electrons, which is essentially a charged battery, right? So that's more or less how a battery works, is by storing those electrons for later use. All right, so electrons in biological systems are going to go ahead and do the same. They're going to go ahead and power biological mechanisms here. Okay, so Again, photosynthesis occurs in two main stages. One is called the light reactions, and the other one is called the Calvin cycle. All right, so the light reactions, just the name kind of gives it to you, right? So what it does, it goes ahead and interacts with light. It absorbs sunlight, and it's able to produce two products. Okay, so ATP and NADPH. NADPH is known as an electron shuttle or also an electron carrier. Okay, so these two molecules, ATP and NADPH, these are going to go and be made. They're going to be generated by the thylakoids, but they're not going to be utilized by the thylakoids. They're only generated by them. As soon as they're made, they go ahead and travel over to the stroma, where they play a role in the Calvin cycle in order to produce glucose. All right, so hopefully that makes a little bit of sense there. So the light reactions, we have a few substances, a few chemicals already involved. And let's look at those chemicals here real quick. First is we have water. Okay, so water, again, it comes from the roots of the plant, from the soil, travels all the way up to the leaves, and it plays a role in the light reactions. As sunlight is hitting those chlorophyll molecules, those chlorophyll molecules become destabilized. Let me go to the image. Okay, those chlorophyll molecules become destabilized. And we're looking at it right here. So sunlight is hitting the chlorophyll molecules, they become destabilized, they release electron molecules from the chlorophyll, electrons rather, not electron, electrons from the chlorophyll molecules. And those electrons start to be transferred over, right, to other photosystems. Okay, photosystems in plant cells are made up of these structures that contain chlorophyll clusters. All right, so those are photosystems right there. They shuttle electrons, right? They transfer electrons from one to the next, in the process, powering these systems. Okay, so for example, from in the middle of this photosystem, there's an electron transport chain, which requires evidently electrons that came from this photosystem. So as these electrons flow, they power this electron transport chain, which allows for the production of ATP, right? From the reaction of ADP, which is adenosine diphosphate, plus phosphate, which is right here. So those two put together makes ATP, in order to make, obviously, adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of all cells. All right, so what is the role of water here? Well, water is going to go ahead and stabilize these chlorophyll molecules again, because if they're not stabilized, then they're going to go ahead and stay unstable just the way sunlight left them, right? So again, that's the importance of water molecules, that it provides the electrons that are necessary to stabilize these chlorophyll molecules after they've interacted with sunlight. Okay, so in that manner, plant cells can reuse chlorophyll molecules and not have to produce chlorophyll molecules all the time. Okay, so not have to generate these all the time, because that would be highly energetic, and it's just much easier, right? So that's the way in which have evolved in order to maintain such a high ATP production rate. All right. So again, water is going to go ahead and be split. That splitting is going to release electrons that the chlorophyll molecules are going to go ahead and utilize to be able to be stabilized again after they've interacted with sunlight, which in and of itself release these electrons. All right, so now I've described this process here, the electron transport chain, which produces ATP. But then there's another process after this photosystem here, right? So this process here produces the electron shuttle, or the electron carrier. It's called NADPH in plants, but then animals also make an analog of this. It's called NADH, okay? But again, we're in plants right now, so we're talking about NADPH. NADPH and ATP, once they're made, again, they contribute to powering essentially the Calvin cycle, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. Right. So again, we can go ahead and generate a chemical equation, right? So we already have one chemical equation that describes the light reactions, right? So we can say that in the chloroplast, water is actually split in order to make ATP and NADPH. Righty, so that right there again can be one of the chemical reactions of photosynthesis. Okay, so we're talking about the light reactions again. It's water plus ADP. So again, ADP, adenosine diphosphate. So a D would be right here. And then NADP plus would be the the precursor to making NADPH. All right, so you have water again, ADP, and NADP plus, yielding ATP and NADPH from the light reactions. So these are the ones I was talking about. Right? So just if you just add water right here, H2O plus NADP plus ADP, yielding again ATP and NADPH, that would be the chemical formula for the light reactions. And that's just half of photosynthesis. Let's go and describe the other half of photosynthesis. So the other half, if you will, is called the Calvin cycle. Okay, so what is the Calvin cycle going to do? Okay, this Calvin cycle is going to go ahead and produce the sugars that the plant needs. Okay, it's going to produce the glucose. All right, so the formula for glucose is C6H12O6. Okay, and it's going to go ahead and do so in a series of 3 stages. We have carbon fixation, we have reduction, and then we have regeneration. Those are the 3 stages of the Calvin cycle. Notice that the Calvin cycle requires CO2, so we can say that the first reactant of the Calvin cycle is CO2, right? So after CO2, we're going to go ahead and utilize ATP, and then we're going to add NADPH in order to yield C6H12O2. And that's it, right? So this is the main product of the Calvin cycle. And I'm sorry, I left out one product of the light reactions is oxygen. So if you go back here, another product here of the light reaction is going to be oxygen, so just plus O2. Okay, because the breakdown of water here is going to go ahead and release oxygen molecules, which are not needed in high quantities by the plant, so they're just released into the environment, and we turn out to be really good at the use of oxygen there, so that we can produce our ATP. All right, so let's see. Let me go straight to the Calvin cycle. And here it is. Okay, so what the Calvin cycle is going to go ahead and require, right? It's going to go ahead and require a few molecules. First is we have ATP, and then we have NADPH. Remember, these two came from the light reactions. And then we have carbon dioxide, which came in via these pores, right, on leaves called stomata. Okay, so where CO2 is found in the air, in the environment, right? It comes in to the leaf via the stomata, which is kind of like a pore. And then those 3 put together inside of the stroma of the chloroplast make up the glucose that is going to be utilized by the plant in order to grow and develop and also make more ATP. Okay, so now during the night, right, plants still need ATP. All right, so But then the thing is that there's no sunlight. So what do plants do at night or when there's no sunlight to maintain their ATP production there? So what they're going to do is they're going to go ahead and utilize the mitochondria. Okay, so by using the mitochondria, providing the mitochondria with the glucose that the stroma has produced, then the mitochondria can go ahead and sustain um, the ATP needs that the plant requires. All right, so now mitochondria also requires oxygen, right? So remember that oxygen is going to go ahead and come from the splitting of water. Now, even though most of the oxygen is going to be released, some of it is actually going to be fed to the mitochondria so that the plant can sustain, again, its energetic needs throughout the night. Okay, so there's other processes. There's many more adaptations that the plant has to include a C4 plant, C3 plant, a crassylation acid metabolism plant. Those are three different ways to carry out photosynthesis, but we're not going to go over those in this lecture. Okay, so now that's one reason for the production of glucose. Another reason is for glucose storage, right? And this is very important in, for example, attracting animals that can go ahead and spread out the seed, right? Spread out the seed of the plant. Now, in cases where plants don't have a seed, right? So like potato plants, for example, they go ahead and store that glucose in the potato itself, right? Now, the potato does not necessarily require a seed. So if you just plant this potato, it'll just grow, start to grow roots, and then eventually grow into a plant itself. You can go ahead and try that out at your house, right? If you just have, potting soil, and you cut a potato into two parts, maybe 4 parts. Go ahead and plant it in the potting soil, and ideally on the floor, on the ground, right? It's a little harder to do and to get these to grow in pots, but you can get it to grow in pots. It's just harder. And then that potato piece is gonna go ahead and give you a new potato plant. Okay, so again, it's guaranteed. I've done it many times. But then in the case of, for example, fruits, right? So fruit-bearing trees and plants, for that matter, fruits have seeds. All right, so if it has a seed, then it's considered a fruit. So these animals go ahead and take take those fruits away from the plant. They consume the fruit, but then later on, as the animal is defecating, right, they go ahead and release that seed through the feces, and then the seeds of the fruit are able to produce new plants, right, for for the parent plant. So that's why it's necessary for plants to be able to store that glucose, so that they can go ahead and spread themselves and keep the species going, right? So again, the actual process of producing the fruit takes more complex mechanisms, which I'm not going to go over here, because what's most important here is metabolism. All right, so a production of ATP and glucose, for that matter. And then the last reason why glucose is necessary is the production of cellulose, which becomes part of the plant cell's cell wall, if you will. Now, since we touched on the mitochondria, let's go ahead and go over cell respiration. Okay, cell respiration requires the use of a mitochondria. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and keep it down to how animals require cell respiration, how we carry out cell respiration. Okay, so now cell respiration is going to go and require a few chemicals. First and foremost, oxygen. Okay, so where do we get oxygen from? Well, we breathe it in, right, from the atmosphere, but it actually came from plants. Okay, most of the water splitting actions of plants releases most of that oxygen, right? And then we're able to breathe in that oxygen so that we can go ahead and collect it inside of our mitochondria, right? So how do we do that? Well, we use our nasal passages, obviously. Okay, so here's a nasal cavity. We breathe in that oxygen. We take it over to the trachea, and then through the use of our bronchi, we're able to divert that oxygen over into our lungs, which contain these alveoli. All right, so alveoli take care of gas exchange by the intrinsic action of the actual alveoli from the lungs and the blood vessels from the circulatory system. Okay, so now once in the blood, oxygen is going to go ahead and make its way all the way over to the cells, where it's going to go ahead and enter the mitochondria, and just wait there for for the presence of glucose, which essentially happens all the time. Because the breakdown, right, the mechanism that breaks down glucose is going to go ahead and be involved in producing a lot of ATP for animal cells, especially through the use of oxygen. So I'll go ahead and mention that in a few minutes. So again, these are the products, right? This is the overall chemical formula of cell respiration. So we require oxygen plus glucose, right? So C6H12O6, and then yielding CO2, ATP, and water. Again, yielding CO2, ATP, and water. And here they are, the other two, ATP and water. Alrighty, so now let's get into a brief introduction to metabolism. All right, so if you just Google metabolism, it's going to go ahead and give you a definition that's somewhere around the lines of metabolism being the sum total of all reactions that take place inside of your cells, which is true in a way, right? In a vague way, it is true, but then there's a lot more involved in actual metabolism. All right, like hormones, for example. If you're talking about animals, we have metabolic hormones that allow us to deal with stored energy. Okay, so when we consume food, we don't necessarily just consume just enough so that we can survive. We were consuming a lot more, especially in developed societies, right, such as the one that we live in the U.S. We are a culture of consumption, so we eat too much. We have way too much food around, and therefore most people tend to eat in excess, right? So what happens to that excess food? Well, that excess food becomes calories. It becomes stored inside of our bodies in in the form of glycogen. Okay, so not only glycogen but also fats. All right, so I'm not sure if you knew, but carbohydrates can actually be turned into fats in case we don't utilize carbohydrates for energy, because that's what carbohydrates are meant to do, is provide quick energy for us, right? So if we're not using these carbohydrates, then guess what's going to happen to them? Well, we're going to go ahead and store them, right, in the form of glycogen, but also in the form of fat in case we're consuming too much carbohydrate, which for the most part, unless obviously you watch your diet very carefully, then you're probably ingesting too many carbohydrates. All right, so in those carbohydrates, they manifest, right? We start growing tissue. For example, adipocytes. Adipocytes are specialized body tissues that store fats. Okay, so they're found all over the body, but mostly within the abdominal region, right? So the abdominal region is one of the first areas of the body that grow, right, in excess, because again of the storage of these excess carbohydrates, but also excess fats. Alrighty, so now that storage of glycogen and fat provides potential energy for us. Okay, so in the form of calories. Alrighty, so this is how we measure how much energy we are actually taking in versus how much energy we're taking out. Okay, so now companies nowadays are obviously required to provide you with nutrition facts, and they're obligated to give you how many calories you're consuming, right? And they give you the total fats, they give you saturated fats, trans fats, cholesterol, sodium, carbohydrates. This is what you would see on a typical food, right? That you actually buy from Walmart or from wherever you buy food, right? So again, this is the amount of potential energy that food is gonna go ahead and provide you with. And then if you wanted to know the breakdown, here's the breakdown, right? Um, of the actual nutrients that the food is actually providing you with, right? But in metabolism, what's most important is the calories, okay? Because these are the ones that are going to go ahead and be stored by your body, but also the ones that are going to be burned by your body, right? So as you take in food and nutrients, right, you go ahead and store that first, you digest that, and then you absorb it, and then you store um, those calories. Okay, that energy in the form of calories. And then as you're moving around, as you're carrying on, performing your everyday tasks, working out, right, walking, and so on, then you're utilizing that stored energy. All right, so you burn out those calories that you in fact do burn out by carrying out your normal everyday activities. Okay, so now if you burn more that you actually take in, or maybe the same, then you're not necessarily going to store too much, okay, because you're utilizing most of what you ate, or maybe even all of what you ate. All right, so that's obviously if you're active, right? If you're going to work every day, and then after work maybe you stop by the gym, maybe you stop by I don't know, by the park, wherever you run, right? And then you do your run, then you start, killing off those calories, burning off those calories. So assuming that you burn more, or maybe even the same, then you're not gonna store any. But then if you don't, burn those calories, and if you're not very active, then obviously, right, your intake is gonna be higher than your out, and therefore than your output, and therefore you're gonna start storing those calories, right, in the form of glycogen, which is found around your muscles and also in your liver, and also in the form of fat, which is, yes, also found around your muscles, but um, everywhere in the body, especially the abdominal region. Okay, so that's why it's important to keep in mind, right? Be mindful of how much we're consuming, how much we're actually using and burning, right? Because otherwise we can run into issues of cardiovascular disease and cancer and so on. So again, cell respiration utilizes oxygen in order to burn sugar. Right. So let's get into the details of how this takes place. So we're going to talk about three stages real quick of cell respiration. The first one happens in the cytoplasm right outside of the mitochondria. It's called glycolysis. The second one happens in the mitochondria. So as soon as we go into the mitochondria, it's called the citric acid cycle. And then the third one is called the electron transport chain, which is in the matrix of the mitochondria. Okay, so these two here are essentially preparatory work for the electron transport chain. What you want to utilize as a large organism, as a large animal with trillions of cells, you want to utilize electron transport chain, right? But without these two, then this one's not going to work, okay? Because glycolysis, citric cycle are going to go ahead and provide the reactants necessary for the electron transport chain to take place. Okay, so they're essentially going to power the electron transport chain. So let's go ahead and look at how that happens. I've already gone through the formula here, right? So glucose from food, oxygen from the environment makes CO2, water, and ATP. Here's glycolysis. As you taking sugar, as you consume carbohydrates, right? As you consume food, most of that food is gonna be absorbed, obviously, by the small intestine. Most of the nutrients are gonna go ahead and make it to the cells, and then some of it's gonna be glucose, which is gonna be broken down by glycolysis. Okay, that's what glycolysis stands for. Glyco is glucose, lysis breakdown. All right, so the breakdown of glucose starts to release these power molecules, if you will, that are going to go and be utilized later on in cell respiration to be able to sustain ATP needs. Okay, so here's more or less what happens here. The reactants of glycolysis are going to be C6H12O6, which is glucose, and then enzymes, okay, are another reactant of glycolysis. Enzymes, there's many different enzymes that play a role in glycolysis. Obviously, we're not going to go over all of those enzymes, but just know that glucose is broken down, right, by those enzymes to produce NADH and pyruvic acid. Okay, so those two molecules are made by the breakdown of glucose. Again, glucose plus enzymes yields NADH and pyruvic acid, and some ATP for that matter. ATP, that's mostly the reason why we carry on with glycolysis, to produce a little bit of ATP. Okay, not enough to sustain our life needs, but at least it's some ATP that contributes, right, to sustaining our life processes here. Okay, so now the NADH that came from glycolysis actually travels into the mitochondria to play a role in the electron transport chain. The ATP actually stays around in the cell so that the cell can utilize ATP for its mechanisms, right? And pyruvic acid actually goes into the mitochondria and plays a role in the citric acid cycle. Okay, so pyruvic acid is one of the reactants of the citric acid cycle. That's the first one. A second reactant here can be enzymes, right? So pyruvic acid plus enzymes yields NADH plus FADH2. These are electron carriers that go ahead and roll over to the electron transport chain. It also yields carbon dioxide, which we mostly breathe out, but not entirely, because we need some carbon dioxide, right, to be able to sustain our buffer needs in the blood. Okay, so we need a buffer in the blood called carbonic acid, which is made by the use of carbon dioxide. Right, so the last product is ATP from the citric acid cycle. Again, pyruvic acid plus enzymes yields NADH, FADH2, CO2, and ATP. Alrighty, so these two right here are going to go ahead and travel over to the electron transport chain. ATP is going to be utilized by the cell to sustain processes. And then CO2 is a byproduct, it's a waste product. We need a little bit of it, but mostly we go ahead and get rid of it. Right, so last but not least is electron transport chain from cell respiration. All right, so this is where everything converges. This is the reason why we carry on with the first two processes. Okay, because without this, again, we could not sustain our energetic needs. Okay, so what the electron transport chain is going to do is it's going to go ahead and utilize the products of glycolysis and the citric acid cycle in order for it to power itself, if you will. Okay. Now, at the end of the electron transport chain, you don't see it here, but it's got an enzyme called ATP synthase. That enzyme is a highly energetic enzyme because it goes ahead and catalyzes a reaction between ADP and phosphate, which produces ATP, right, in higher quantities. Again, you don't see it here because it's out of the scope of the course, but regardless, at the end of the electron transport chain, there is a large enzyme that produces about 30 ATP from the breakdown of one glucose molecule. Alrighty, so again, the or last but not least, it would be the formula for the electron transport chain, which can be said to be NADH plus FAH plus oxygen giving off ATP. Okay, so ATP plus water actually, because that's what oxygen is used for, in order to be the last electron acceptor for the electron transport chain. Okay, so being the last electron acceptor, oxygen is actually turned into water right inside of the mitochondria, and that water just recirculates, back into the cell, and then a high amount of ATP is produced by that process right there. All right, so this right here is the reason why this process is also known as aerobic respiration, because again of the use of oxygen in the process. All right, so let's differentiate between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. The first one, right, utilizes oxygen, and the second one doesn't. That's the main difference between two. But then mechanistically, right, physiologically, they work in different ways. Due to the fact that anaerobic respiration does not require oxygen, it does produce ATP, but it's going to do so in a very low amount, right? So the amount of ATP that comes out of anaerobic respiration is going to be really, really low. And then there's going to be various end products of anaerobic respiration. For example, lactic acid is one, and alcohol or ethanol is another one, right? So that second one we actually take advantage of in producing some everyday products that we consume, like alcohol, for example, wine, right, tequila, but also in the making of yogurts, pepperoni, olives, pickles, right? So it's important in food production. But then in order to produce alcohol, we need to go ahead and do something called fermentation, which is, in a nutshell, anaerobic respiration. Okay, so what is anaerobic respiration? Well, this type of respiration is essentially glycolysis, right? That recycles its electron shuttle, right? So it just continues to recycle that electron shuttle, and in that manner, ATP can be pumped out in low amounts, but continuously, if you will. Okay, so now there's another form of anaerobic respiration. It's called lactic acid fermentation, which occurs in our bodies. Okay, it occurs in our muscles as well. So now, sometimes our oxygen demands are so high. For example, when we're running, when we've been running for a long time, our oxygen demands are really, really high. Okay, so there's only so much oxygen that electron transport chain can utilize. All right, but then we supply the mitochondria with more oxygen than that it actually can use, right? So what happens here is that when when we're utilizing our muscle cells to the max, we're actually going to go and rely on both aerobic and anaerobic fermentation in order to churn out more ATP from those processes. Okay, so at the same time, we're actually utilizing glycolysis. We're utilizing the citric acid cycle. We're utilizing the electron transport chain, plus we're utilizing lactic acid fermentation, again, due to the fact that our mitochondria can only utilize so much oxygen at one time, right? So there's other processes that allows us to go ahead and carry on with fermentation here, but just know that fermentation has a byproduct called lactic acid, okay, which is in some part responsible for some of the sore pain that you feel after a big workout, right? Again, it's just part of it. Evidently, another part is muscle tear, right? Microscopic muscle tear, which we actually need to fix, right? And we're fixing, and that's essentially the reason why we feel pain after a big workout. Again, because in some part because of lactic acid, but then in other part because of the muscular tears that we undergo. All right. So again, our metabolism, right, is, yes, it is the sum total of all the reactions that take place in the body, right, in cells. But it's more than that because there's also hormones that are involved. Okay, so some of those reactions that I showed you right now, from glycolysis, the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain, all of those contribute to metabolism, right, to the make ATP. And that's essentially what it is. Metabolism is making energy so that we can have ATP available to do all types of work. Okay, so last but not least is all food can provide us with the energy required for the fuel required for metabolism to take place. But again, one of the most important fuel sources is carbohydrates, right? Because carbohydrates can be utilized as quick energy sources, and therefore becoming the main energy source for all of us. But again, regardless, okay, you can go ahead and convert amino acids, proteins into some form, right, of energy that you can actually break down through glycolysis, um, and and be able to produce energy from there, right? So you've probably heard of the what's it called, the keto diet, if I'm not mistaken. I think that's the name of it. So what that does is it utilizes, for the most part, anything other than carbohydrates, right, to be able to produce food. If I'm not mistaken, correct me if I'm wrong. People on the keto diet don't consume a lot of carbohydrates, right? If they do consume, it's going to be a very low amount of carbohydrates. So what they're doing is they're relying on everything else, right? Like protein, for example, fats, um, meat, right? Fish, beans, eggs, and so on for their energy supply, which does happen. Don't get me wrong. Right? So you can convert protein, amino acids into in lipids, for that matter, into energy. But then one of the byproducts of doing that is ketones. Right? Ketones turn out to be a little bit acidic, right? So if you're doing that in a chronic way for a prolonged period of time, then you can, make your blood slightly acidic, which can be somewhat bad for your body, right? The reason why it doesn't show negative symptoms in people under that diet is because, again, their bodies are able to deal deal with those byproducts in a consistent manner by the use and excretion of urea, for example, right? Now, but then assuming that a person, for example, with diabetes, right? A diabetic person can actually go into ketoacidosis, right? Because that person cannot deal with the byproducts of breaking down proteins, for example, and lipids for energy, right? So now, in diabetic ketoacidosis, diabetic people cannot naturally use glucose as an energy um, source. So therefore, without the use of insulin, they're relying on proteins, lipids, right, and their own proteins to be able to sustain the energy needs of the body. But then the issue with them is they have other problems, right? They have other metabolic problems that are not allowing them to deal with how much ketones are being built into their blood, right? So again, their blood becomes slightly acidic, which, if they don't deal with that, it can become problematic. All right. So that was the last topic I wanted to cover here in Energy and Life lecture. If you do have any questions, please be sure to send them over to me by email, or maybe ask me to, schedule a virtual office meeting with me. So there it is. Have a good day.